If you're considering having nasal surgery, either for yourself or for a loved one, then I made this video to help enable you to make an informed decision about your nasal surgery. There are many thousands that have been harmed by nasal surgeries, including myself. So the goal of my research-based website and the goal of my little talk here today is to make sure that this doesn't happen to you. So I'll tell you a little bit about me real quick of how I got where I am to make this video for you. I had a nasal surgery in 2006 after feeling like I couldn't breathe through my nose. I was having trouble sleeping, and unbeknownst to me at the time, I later found out it was due to allergy with wheat, and the wheat was ripping up my stomach, and that was making it susceptible to other things like dairy, but really the only one problem I had was a wheat allergy. So anyway, I had this surgery because I didn't know any better. The doctor talked me into it, and I agreed to what was called a submucosal resection, SMR they call it, which is supposedly the most conservative surgery if you're going to have the surgery, but that's not actually what happened. I found out years later that it was actually a turbinectomy. Long story short, but the first thing to tell you is that these doctors don't follow informed consent rules quite often. They will do whatever they want. They will tell you that they'll do an SMR and will do what's called a subtotal, where they cut off whole cross-sectional areas, or they could even do a total turbinectomy where they cut higher and they remove your whole turbinate. They could cut out portions of your septum, so you might agree to a septoplasty, and rather than the septum, they'll do your turbinates or both, or oftentimes they'll even do three. They'll operate on your sinus walls without telling you. They can do 2 or 3 things, all under the guise of trimming a little tissue. So after the surgery, I felt worse, not better, and my sleep got worse. And on top of that, I started experiencing some pretty odd sensations that I had never experienced before, and it took me a long time to figure out what was going on. But at that time, after 6 months of suffering, and I was sure it was still my nose was the root cause, I saw my second opinion doctor, and he talked me into a second nasal surgery, which was a really dumb idea, and a lot of people go down this path. If you have one and it's not working, that's your clue something's wrong, right? So I agreed to the second nasal surgery, where he agreed to trim a little more tissue further back. And of course, years later, I found out that he did way more than he promised as well. That was written on the surgery report that I got years later. So after the second surgery, I felt way worse, really bad. And this was going on for years, and my whole life was declining at this point in every way. And eventually I found a doctor who told me about empty nose syndrome. He pulled me aside where no one could hear, and he told me that I likely had empty nose syndrome and what it was. And so I work in engineering, and I became aware of empty nose syndrome looking at all these websites, and I found a lot of people on there that were presenting these symptoms and complaining, and they were pretty isolated because doctors pretty much ignore them, because even if they know what the issue is, a lot of them know, but there's nothing they can do about it. It's irreversible damage. And so being that I work in engineering, I saw some of these nasal studies where they study how air flows through the nose, and they're called CFD studies, computational fluid dynamics. And I said, hey, I work in an engineering place, I've got the software, and I wound up modeling my own CT scans here and running air through my nose, and this is what air looks like when it traverses your nose. And so I basically did my own studies, and I compared it to studies done at Harvard and all these universities, and what they saw with empty nose syndrome. And I learned a lot, and that's what I'm presenting to you here today. So your first goal, and the goal of any good doctor, is to try to actually avoid nasal surgery in the first place. If the inside of your nose is inflamed and you're having trouble breathing through your nose, there's likely a reason why your tissue is swelling. Many people have environmental allergies, whether it be to dust or mold or things in the air, whether it be at work or at home, outside in your environment. Or, more likely these days, more and more common is food allergies. Food is quite different these days. The wheat has been genetically modified, the soils have changed, the fertilizers have changed. A lot of people are having trouble with wheat. I did personally. So I had what was called an IgG and IgE antibody food test. They call it a food panel. So you can have your blood drawn and have a food panel run, and it will expose your blood to all these different food groups and see what it is that you react to. And for me, that result was dead on. It showed that I had allergies to wheat and dairy were the highest spikes. So I highly recommend looking into allergies first, because there's a reason that your inner nasal lining is swelling up in the first place. And you don't want to go brute force having an irreversible surgery where you overcorrect for something that may very well be a temporary condition for you. Because when that tissue reverses and the swelling goes down, you will be wide open and you'll be in a world of trouble if that happens. So first, you could also try some generic conservative therapies like nasal cones that you put in that help open your nose at night. They have breathe right strips. If you try those things and you need a little more help, you can try a CPAP machine. I highly recommend it. I know people aren't that into it, but if you're having issues and you need some help, if it's done on nasal surgery or CPAP, you should really try a CPAP. So they make some pretty thin line ones like this that fit just under the nose if you need just a little help. They of course have the full face mask ones, which I know a lot of people are not into. It's not the lifestyle we all imagine for ourselves, and I get that. There are some smaller, more comfortable mask designs where it fits under your nose and over your mouth, and they're not too bad. So I highly, highly recommend, before I even get started with this video and talking about nasal surgery, I want to impress that you should be looking for ways to avoid nasal surgery in the first place. Find out what your issue is, get some extra help, try these things before you consent to something that is irreversible, because there are bad things that can happen, and the goal of my talk here today will be to explain all those things for you so you can make an informed decision about your nasal surgery. So I am including an example of a food panel here. I'm showing you my results so you can see what happens if maybe you want to get tested. But in this top first section for dairy, you can see I reacted to milk and whey. And then the second sheet, you can see I reacted to wheat at the bottom here. That's moderate. Now, the reaction to whey and milk was actually higher than wheat, but wheat turned out to be my main culprit. It was wrecking my stomach and exposing it to milk and whey. So you can just look at all these other food groups and you can see how they're kind of a non-issue. There are very low bars on here except for those. And some doctors, like I said, regular medical doctors sometimes poo-poo these tests as giving false positives, but I'll tell you, for me it was dead on, and the results you see here led me to getting an irreversible nasal surgery. So in my last segment, I forgot one of the conservative therapies that you should always try first, and that is nasal steroid sprays. That said, I found this great video that I also recommend for you. It's from Dr. Jeffrey Terrell at the University of Michigan, and he did a video called 10 Reasons Not to Have Sinus Surgery. So he's not against surgery by any means. It's just rare to find a doctor anywhere that's less than 101% positive about nasal surgery, and they also just happen to make money from it. So he also did a video called 10 Reasons When You Should Have Sinus Surgery. I want to go on record here as well, right up front, that I am not against all sinus surgery. I am, however, definitely against aggressive sinus surgery, and I have a post on what makes a sinus surgery aggressive. And then I'm also here to warn you that even of the more conservative procedures that are out there these days that are performed, it still doesn't mean you can't be damaged. And there are still plenty of people out there that are damaged in a major way from a lot of these surgeries and procedures that are considered conservative. So for example, here's a doctor from Korea that was presenting in London, and he's noting a second doctor, quote here, that not only total turbinate excision, but also more conservative procedures such as submucosal cautery, submucosal resection, laser therapy, radiofrequency, which is RF, and cryosurgery can induce ENS. So first he's referring to what another doctor said in the bubble above, and then I typed up his quote. He said, "This is what I experienced in my practice, and they insist that turbinoplasty is safe, but I saw many patients with ENS from turbinoplasty." So that's just a warning. Now, it's not the majority, but when it happens, it is life-altering bad. In my video, I'm going to take a hard look at how surgeries can affect you.
I'm showing you this next slide to visually help you appreciate what normal breathing looks and feels like. When I started reading CFD studies online and I saw this picture, right away it reinforced in my mind what I remembered breathing as feeling like. This shows how air flows through the nose in a color-coded fashion. Air comes into your nose from the outside world. It's narrowed down inside your nasal nares, where it is further compressed once it hits the heads of your inferior turbinates. This transitions from a nice calm laminar flow to a turbulent flow situation, where it is evenly distributed throughout your nose and contacts the walls of your mucosal tissue. And as soon as I saw this picture, it immediately reminded me of my former life and what it felt like to breathe. If you close your eyes and breathe through your nose right now and pay attention, you'll feel this nice cooling sensation of air moving through your nose. You can feel it in your brain too, and a sense of calm prevails. If you really concentrate and you breathe in deeply, you'll feel 2 or 3 slight impulses as you breathe deeper and deeper. This is your diaphragm muscle pulling in response to the signal of airflow in your brain. Meditation keys off this breathing to calm your parasympathetic nervous system, and is that same sensation that lets you know you're alive. On the best days of your life, if you stand in a meadow or on a cliff overlooking the ocean, and you attempt to feel every bit of that moment, you breathe in, you close your eyes. I know you can see yourself doing this because we all do it. There is that feeling and reward in the brain for breathing and for being alive that confirms your daily experiences. But for many thousands who have had nasal surgeries, this pleasant positive feeling has been taken away and replaced with a wide array of horrid symptoms that make it feel more like you're dying every day than living, and it's called empty nose syndrome. Many with this outcome have actually killed themselves. This BuzzFeed article is about one such member of our group out of many who sadly chose to kill themselves rather than live with this debilitating condition. Empty nose syndrome is iatrogenic, which means medically caused. Now, some doctors can get quite defensive rather quickly when using this term, and to me, this implies a sense of culpability. If they were truly armed with good facts from their years of research, they wouldn't need to get defensive. But their standard response is that it's rare, but it's not rare in the true sense of the word at all. Unfortunately, what it is more and more common. Besides the BuzzFeed article that I just showed you, it's been out there in the news. It's been talked about on the Megyn Kelly Show. It's been on People magazine. It's been mentioned in the Huffington Post, on ABC News, CBS. It's been in the New York Post. Dr. Mercola's talked about it, and it's worldwide. There have been stories and articles in France, another one in France, Germany, in Korea, in China, another one in China, a very sad story where a patient there with empty nose syndrome actually killed his doctor over this. It's been in India, in the UK, and if you look online, there are support groups out there on Facebook and Tap Talk and other places with thousands of members each, literally from all over the world and from all walks of life, that have been seriously harmed by these so-called routine nasal surgeries. And unfortunately, I've seen a steady stream of new members arriving every week for years complaining about these exact symptoms. This group is underreported and underdiagnosed, and the flow has still been increasing. For these people, they can no longer sense airflow. With ENS, you feel like you're suffocating or drowning all the time. Your brain longs for a connection that will never again come. It's like holding your breath, but forever. Rather than being a daily calming influence and a clock for your parasympathetic nervous system as before, breathing is now a constant source of anxiety for your nervous system, as your nervous system is no longer grounded. It's constantly triggered into a fight or flight survival mode, and this constant adrenaline rush condition is tiring and taxing on your body and starts to burn you out over time. And even worse, there is no rest from empty nose syndrome as you permanently lose your ability to sleep. Autonomic breathing, which is what you're doing while you're sleeping, is disrupted due to severed and damaged nerves in the nose and this results in permanent, surgically induced central sleep apnea. Your diaphragm, lungs, chest muscles, brain, and nose all work together to trigger a breath, then drive the breath deeper using input from the nerves in your nose, sensing flow via changes in temperature and pressure. With that feedback severed, the result is shallow chest breathing, poor regulation, and sleep deprivation for many of these people, including myself. A lack of nasal resistance also makes it harder to inflate your lungs, leading to overbreathing and breathlessness during even mild to moderate exertion.
So I'm going to share a quick video with you from a doctor who sees what I see. This is Dr. Douglas Scarata, and he hails from Salem, Oregon at a place called the Modern Nose Clinic. Now, Dr. Scarata has some really good online videos I suggest you check out and further educate yourself about nasal surgeries and how it should and shouldn't be done. But he admits freely that he, in the past, had done some damaging type, older style nasal surgeries himself, but he came around to realizing that they're bad and they're destructive, and he's seen damaged people from these surgeries, and he has changed his mindset. Now, it's kind of frightening that there are doctors out there that still think it's like the 1950s or 1960s, and they're referring to some really old, outdated studies on turbinectomies where they think they're useful, and they didn't do good follow-up studies. They didn't measure much of anything. So I'm going to get into studies and doctors' justifications a little later. But right now, the important thing is that Dr. Scarata says that not only does empty nose syndrome exist, which some deny, he said it's not rare, and that he sees patients with this at least once a week.
So, empty nose syndrome, when you read about it on the internet, and I encourage you to read a little bit about it on the internet, there's a couple of incorrect things. For one thing, they say that it's a rare disease, and some ear, nose, and throat doctors are unsure if it really exists. Oh, it exists. There's no doubt it exists. And really, if an ear, nose, and throat doctor bothers to go to any rhinology meeting like the American Rhinology Society, which is fantastic, plug for them, there's no one there who would tell you otherwise. So I wouldn't call it controversial in regards to its existence, but it's unclear why people get it. I can tell you some general terms or general ideas to consider. It seems to happen when the nose has been overly resected. So if any of you out there are considering getting a nasal surgery, take your time and think about this potential complication.
Okay, so his candor on this topic is very rare. It's revealing and perhaps a bit unsettling. He says that empty nose syndrome tends to occur when the tissue has been over-resected. Well, resected means cut, so too much cut out. And he says that you should be aware of this potential complication if you're considering nasal surgery. Now, that's very frank advice coming from a doctor, and it's very good advice. But this will put you in a bind as a patient, and perhaps alarm bells should be going off in your head and exposing that some of this is very arbitrary and that there are no rules and standards for this group of doctors. So just to explain, is it your job, if you hire an electrical contractor, to know what gauge wire belongs behind your wall for an oven versus some basic lighting, or how many amps of a circuit breaker is supposed to be, or how many feet up the wall do you need to staple the wire to pass state code in your area? I mean, it's ridiculous. People specialize in things, and it's their job to know. It's not your job as a patient or a customer to know such things. It is your doctor's responsibility not to over-resect your nose. It's your doctor's job to inform you of the basic functions of your nose, explain where your problem lies, and plainly explain which procedure, named procedure, they intend to do to help you.
Now, if you've tried conservative therapies and they haven't worked and you're now considering nasal surgery, this is a rather daunting list of procedures to be hit with. And your doctor may be advising one or oftentimes multiple of these procedures at the same time. So how do you know which one is right for you? Which one should you get? The good one? The crappy one? The one that's easier for them? Or the one that's best for you and provides safe, long-lasting results? Well, how would you know? Your doctor may be advising a septoplasty, or a turbinoplasty, or a submucosal resection, performed a variety of different ways, or he may be advising both, or maybe even all three of these. Now how about a subtotal inferior turbinectomy, or a total inferior turbinectomy? Should you take out half of it, or all of it? So which of your turbinates is better to operate on, the inferior turbinate or the middle turbinate? Which one is better? Here's a quick study I saw. It's a rather binary outcome, but on the left is a normal person, and in the middle they removed the middle turbinate, and most of the air flows through the middle meatus of the nose, and on the right is one where they removed the whole inferior turbinate, and the air comes in and flows along the bottom floor of your nose. Which one is better, and how would you know? Well, this is actually a trick question because I don't like either of these two. Or how about a radio frequency procedure, often referred to as RF? Now, to most of you, I bet this looks similar to ordering off of a menu at a foreign restaurant that you've never been to before. But some of these procedures are definitely more damaging than others, and it would behoove you to definitely read up and study up on whatever is being recommended for you and make your own decision. The fact that several methods for turbinate reduction are used clearly demonstrates that there's apparently no ideal technique which guarantees long-term therapy success, but which is rather linked with short and or long-term complications. Now this is written by Dr. Mark Oliver Scheithauer, who I feel did one of the best studies I've seen called Surgery of the Turbinates and Empty Nose Syndrome. So even though you can see a heavy negative connotation from what Dr. Mark is saying, you can see that he writes very professionally and respectfully, even when he has something that's not quite easy to say. I'm probably not going to be quite as delicate and restrained as Dr. Mark, and I'm more likely to share my unvarnished opinions with you going forward here. So we're going to look at some sinus CT scans together, and I want to look at normal. So if you just go to Google and type in normal sinus CT scans, these are the kinds of images that come up. So you can see my top left, I got a yellow arrow. It says normal inferior turbinates. Top right image underlined normal, normal. Bottom left image, yellow arrow, normal. Okay? So this is our baseline for what normal people are supposed to look like. So the top left image lays out just a quick basic anatomy of where your inferior turbinates are. They're these large structures on the bottom. They're roughly the size of your pinky and about 6 to 7 centimeters long, and they hang suspended in your cavity in the airway. Above those, the smaller turbinates are your middle turbinates. And if you follow my mouse up and down, that long center strip is made of bone and cartilage. That's your nasal septum, and that just mechanically separates the two cavities into roughly equal halves. Now in CT scans, black is airspace. So the area where we actually breathe through is, if you follow my mouse from the top on down, see these long, thin black strips that go around the turbinates? This is the area that you actually breathe through. So this large black space on either side, those are your maxillary sinuses, and you don't breathe through those. They are vented to air, but they're not meant to be opened to air. You don't breathe through those. They're ventilated, but they're not open. I've seen CT scans and plenty of doctors that not only have removed and severely cut down these inferior turbinates, but if you follow my mouse on the right, they've actually cut these walls out and totally ventilated the sinuses. And I've seen a lot of these empty nose people online complaining with facial pain. It hurts to breathe. It's dry. They get headaches. Nasty stuff. I don't recommend that. I'd be careful. So on the top right, again, you see thin, black, even air strips here. Now this person's, the inferior turbinates are curved, and that's fine. These are just a little more rounded. Each person's anatomy differs a little. This person on the bottom left has slightly larger gaps. I saw one good doctor that told me that the normal human air gap is around 2 millimeters. Now the cavities are roughly about 10 to 12 millimeters wide, and the gaps are about 2 millimeters. So now if you look on the bottom right, this person has a deviated septum. So that center line has been pushed over to one side. Now most people have a deviated septum to some degree. There's very few people that have perfectly straight nasal septums. Some people it's mild and they're not bothered by it. Some people have more deviation and more deformity and they're really bothered. They can only breathe out of one side. And for those, hey, I highly recommend looking into some kind of nasal surgery and getting it fixed. And hopefully that surgery is performed properly. The only problem I have is that a lot of doctors' response to this bottom right CT scan is to do things like this. They go ahead and they produce hugely abnormal CT scans, and then they're mystified by any instances of failure. They can't quite comprehend or believe that you could possibly be in pain or suffering, because their common excuse when you approach them years later in pain as to why they would possibly do something like this to you, they say, well, I had patients that had cancer and I removed everything and they were fine. Well, I never liked that excuse. That's not scientific justification to do this to the other 99.99% of the population that didn't have cancer. You know, I got away with it isn't science. With that kind of stupid line of thinking, like for instance this brake job, you see this wheel cylinder is leaking in the top left here where my mouse is. I could ignore that, and years down the road when you're working these things hard, they'll pop out, spray fluid all over these drums, they won't work, and you'll have a dead family on your hands. Or this fuse box. You can see that obviously the fuses were blowing and some genius decided to short the contacts together with screwdrivers rather than fix it. This would appear to work right up front, but later when you're running too much current and the wires heat up behind the wall, you would have a house fire. So these are just two simple quick examples of what's called a latent failure. A latent failure is when there is some kind of initial damage that's not evident right up front, but appears over time at a later point in time. Many people with empty nose have issues right away. They wake up and they're either in pain or they feel suffocation right away, but there's another subset of people who after years later develop these symptoms. The tissue basically never gets a chance to rest from what is now turbulent air currents and too much air, and the tissue dries out and gets sclerotic, and the nerves eventually atrophy, and once the nerves start to hurt, basically when you breathe air, it's like breathing gasoline. It hurts, it burns. It's a really bad idea to do this to people. So this kind of idiotic reasoning and logic is just faulty. It's not science. It has no place in science. They should not be doing this to normal people that don't have cancer. Now we're going to get to the meat and potatoes of what likely brought you here. You simply want to know if this can happen to you. Can my life be ruined by nasal surgery? Yes. Actually, yes, way. There are no safeguards in place to assure that it doesn't. I will be presenting more and more detailed evidence as I progress here, but for now I want to start the ball rolling with 10 quick indisputable facts. I also encourage comments and public discourse on this video. I even welcome any doctors who are ENS deniers to debate me in person at one of your fancy conferences. 1. Doctors in this field routinely work without informed consent. Most people who were harmed show up saying they were never warned about ENS. Their excuse that I've heard is that they feel it's rare and not worth mentioning. A far more direct legal failure on their part, though, directly occurs from doing procedures other than what was discussed and agreed to, and by doing extra procedures above and beyond what was agreed to. And this is widespread, and it makes a mockery of the law. Last, rarely do they even inform you of the 3 basic functions of the nose and what you may lose. 2. This sounds like a joke, but sadly not. I was told that the nasal turbinates were useless structures that were in my way, and also that people in the desert had theirs removed and they were fine. So stupidity like this comes from somewhere. I wondered if it was from the medical schools, but I later found out it came from one particular study and their decades full of dismal, incomplete, crappy, and conflicting research. 3. Dr. Mark already told us this. If one procedure was known best, you would think they would all be doing it, right? 4. Having no specifications and allowing everyone to do whatever they want to whatever degree they want in engineering and manufacturing leads to complete disaster. So why would that be different here? 5. Nasal surgery is irreversible. Once turbinate bone and valuable mucosa tissue have been cut, it is gone forever. This tissue you were born with is in the trash. If the whole turbinate and bone is removed, there is no replacing that free-hanging structure ever again. Once nerves are cut or burned, they are lost and damaged forever. 6. Their own research is what's controversial. Find me one study that advocated for particular surgeries where they measured any of the 3 basic functions of the nose before and after. I'll wait. Here are a few quick looks at some of their studies to get your head screwed on right. So this would be funny if it weren't true, but it's true, so it's actually pretty sad. But the same group here that told you that people in the desert are fine without turbinates start off their little study by warning that the surgical treatment of turbinate swelling remains controversial, and that a wide variety of surgical procedures is performed, get this, with universally unsatisfactory results. Next, Dr. Mark, I believe, refers to their claims of success in the desert and notes other studies that found that 214 out of 242 cases of confirmed atrophic rhinitis, which is kind of like ENS, it's similar, 166 developed after nasal surgery, and 95% of those had undergone a turbinectomy. Next, a study by Huizing, where he looked at everyone else's studies, said it was difficult to draw firm conclusions due to a lack of qualified studies, and said most authors either advocate a new method or report on a retrospective study of their own results and offer unproven personal opinions. We're going to look at more of this stuff later. It can be a little boring, but here's the executive summary for you for now. Seven. All I can say is true. And all these forums full of people over the years that I've met and talked to, they are there due to every procedure ever offered and every tool ever used, even from just septoplasty alone. I have even seen a few that had cosmetic rhinoplasty surgeries only, and their nose changed their inner dynamics of how air goes in, and they lost their ability to sleep anyway, same as the others. 8. Not only severing nerves, but changing the forces that act on them. They don't warn you that you may never sleep normally again. Talk about informed consent. I wrote 2 database studies on this that you can read on my site here. And I measured, calculated, and wrote more than you can probably stand to read on this topic here. The second was a huge study where I measured my own sleep for weeks and months before and after 2 nasal implant surgeries, where I had tissue put back inside my nose to narrow my airway back down. I proved that bad surgeries cause central sleep apnea by severing nerves, changing resistance, velocity, pressure, shear stress, and distribution patterns. It proved that filling my nose back in and creating resistance helped me to sleep better. I sent my results to Dr. Mark Oliver Scheithauer in Germany, telling him that I had proven what he said in his study to be true. And I told him that I mentioned his study to a doctor at University of Washington, and that he laughed in my face when I told him that feedback from the nose helps to drive sleep. Dr. Mark gave me some really nice feedback, pardon the pun, on my work. You can see all the daily charts here from that study. They're all lined up with the deepest drop in O2 saturation points in time, and then all averaged to give me composites for those time periods. After filling my nose back in, the roll-off drops in O2 were less severe and autonomic control was way better. Also, looking at the standard deviation of my O2 readings, you can clearly see lower numbers and more stability after each implant. And you can see that the stability also got worse again as the implant shrank away over time. Twice. So not only can doctors be wrong, but many also lie to protect other doctors. Greg Davis and his gal sidekick, Dr. Levine, at the University of Washington lied to me when I wanted simple confirmation that what had been done to me was a subtotal turbinectomy and not an SMR like I was promised. So be warned. And here's a pro tip for you. Remember that you're paying money to be there, and you're paying a lot of money. Often $700 every time they look in your nose with a scope. If they're being condescending to you and giving you the runaround and being disrespectful, I suggest you just walk out. And not only that, I would file a formal complaint and refuse to pay. Matter of fact, I did. The ones that are really good are great, and the ones that are not so good make your life kind of miserable. 9. You are rich right now. If you can run, hike, bicycle, read books to your kids without being out of breath, you're rich. It's like having precious capital to spend, so spend it wisely. Educate yourself. Realize there are limits. Set limits yourself and make doctors promise to adhere to those limits. 10. No one is watching out for you. I euphemistically refer to this chapter as no one gives a shit. As a patient, you would think you're protected by large organizations and rules. If you're young and idealistic like I was, or older and just dumb, the answer is no. Many assume there are these large government agencies and everyone knows what they're doing. That some kind of organization sets rules for care to keep everyone safe and be responsible and take care of you if they fail. Wrong. You're on your own. I looked. Maybe the American Medical Association would care. It's a big official sounding name and I've heard it my whole life. They're an association of doctors for doctors, not for you. They lobby for doctors and write nice sounding mission statements. They are a black hole. There is no contact number for them. They have no legal authority to do anything regarding malpractice. There's an automated menu and none of the choices lead to a human. If you look on their site and can even locate the complaint form, go ahead and fill one out. Nothing will happen. They recommend sending complaints to your state medical licensing board, and I got a lot of inaction from them, and when finally pressed, they blamed it on the age of the complaint. So if ENS comes on years later for you, good luck. I got the feeling it was clear they weren't going to do anything about it anyway. Okay, so how about the ABMS, or the American Board of Medical Specialties? They're not set up to hear anything from you, and will direct you to your ENT doctor subspecialty, the ABO, American Board of Otolaryngology. So if you contact the ABO, their answer is, we just give tests. And when I asked who makes the test that educates these doctors, I was directed to the American Academy of Otolaryngology. Because my real motivation for tracking these people down and trying to pin them down was, I wanted to know who says it's okay to cut out people's turbinates, and in particular, I wanted to know who was teaching that people in the desert are fine without nasal turbinates. I wanted to know if that was on one of their tests, like multiple choice or something. And their answer was, we just write clinical practice guidelines in journals, and doctors may follow them or they may not. And then she said, board-certified doctors are allowed to treat on an individual basis. Translation, they can do anything they want to you. They also mysteriously had nothing to say when I asked why doctors fail to follow basic informed consent laws. There is another organization out there called the American Rhinological Society, or ARS, and if you contact the ARS, they're quick to inform you that they are merely a society to promote education and advance research. And these are all good things and noble goals, but that they are not a rule-setting, governing body.
Golf clap? Golf clap.
Okay, I guess that's fair enough. But who exactly does watch out for people in terms of safety for nasal surgery? The Teamsters Union? So you finally realize that there is no one responsible for anything, and that doctors are totally unregulated and free shooting from the hip. If they see a study that sounds interesting, they can practice it on you, and they are accountable to no one. They can do whatever they want to you. If you remember when you were a kid and you messed up and you had that feeling like you were in the biggest trouble of the world, it seemed like the worst thing in your life, and there was a feeling of doom, it was always temporary, wasn't it? It always moved on. Your mom helped, or your dad helped. Well, your mommy or your daddy can't help you with this one. Your God-given anatomy from birth is irreplaceable, so don't let them destroy you. I have another really good quick list here of things to kind of look out for and keep in mind so that when you hear them, they'll make sense to you and you'll know why. In life, we often wish that people told us things, and hindsight is 20/20. You always wish that you knew, and you wish that someone told you. Well, consider this your little golden voice from the future telling you no. So here's some quick things that you'll often hear from them. So before the surgery, when they're selling you on it, you often hear, "This is routine. We do this all the time. Hey, we're just trimming a little tissue." That's a good one. No warning that it may ruin sleep for the rest of your life. No warning of severing connections that run your autonomic central nervous system, which will trigger your nervous system to self-destruct from within. Little to no information on the function of the nose regarding heating, humidifying, filtering. We already know that. They often fail to disclose the exact name of their intended procedure. A turbinectomy is not trimming a little tissue. So be on the alert for the trimming a little tissue, pin them down, find out exactly which procedure or procedures they intend to do to you. Read up on them and make sure that you're comfortable with the amount of things being done to you. So I like this one. If you mention ENS, they all say, well, I'm careful. I don't cause ENS because I don't remove the whole thing. That's a really good one. So no warnings of ENS or atropic rhinitis despite an estimated 20% risk with a turbinectomy. And there's actually still risk with other procedures too, which they just don't seem to tell you. And my favorite that I heard, the turbinates were useless structures that were just in my way. Now this is important. This is the part that's just gold that you wish someone told you. So if you have the surgery and things seem awry to you and they're not going well, and you start going back, complaining, or searching for answers, you get denial and justification. My favorite, number one, everything looks fine in there. Denial. And I've had some patients where I removed everything and they were fine. So justification. It's your fault. The problem's in your head. Justification. It's your fault. Well, you must be a poor healer. Justification. It's your fault. Well, some people are just predisposed to depression and anxiety. Justification. Must be your fault again. Well, you looked on the internet and saw ENS, and it's an ENS type culture. Justification. It's your fault. You looked. People in the desert had theirs removed and they were fine. Justification. Must be your fault. I hope this information serves you well. So this is an unfortunate real-life example of exactly what it looks like when you're having trouble after the nasal surgery and you go back and they look in there and say, everything looks great, you're fine, problems in your head. So this exposes the gaps in their understanding that they really have no idea that nasal resistance is crucial, how much nasal resistance you should have, and what kind of a target or specification are they trying to go for to begin with when they operate on you in terms of where they want to leave you. They have no idea. So this is Scott Gaffer's mother. Scott was a member of our group who's unfortunately no longer with us due to empty nose. And this is her recollecting going back to the doctor and having Scott explain that he had no nasal resistance. And she said it sounded like when he breathed that his nose was, it was like blowing air through a straw.
I did go with him to the follow-up visit, and I remember him, her posting the picture of his, the endoscopy, showing how great his nose looked inside. The septum was perfectly straight, like he would, press on the open nostril. And the other one, it sounded like, kind of like air going through a straw. They said that you couldn't hear any resistance. And at the time, I really wasn't understanding. She was saying, look, everything looks so beautiful.
So these are CAD model slices from my website of my actual CT scans before I had any surgeries ever and after I had these horrible destructive surgeries. So I pretty much had the same thing that Scott had. My nose sounded like blowing a little piece of tissue paper like a spitball through a hollow straw when I breathed. That's what it sounded like. So if you can look at the bottom image here, this was before I was ever operated on. I had about 1.5 millimeter gap at the inferior turbinate head, maybe 3 ahead of that, 1 on the other side, which was a little tight. However, they opened it up here to 7 millimeters across just this one section here. The cavity behind it, they left a giant gaping hole 11 or 12 millimeters wide. They took out so much tissue from my septum that this is a flashlight shining through one side of my nose, and you could see light shining right through a hole, and that's this area down here where it says 1.76 millimeters. They left so little tissue and cartilage that there's a hole right through it. So any doctor that can look in this nose and think that it looks fine, or it looks okay, it's not. They have no idea what they're looking at. They had no idea what they were trying to achieve to begin with. They had no standards for anything. So if you're sitting in front of a doctor and he's selling you on a surgery, this is what air looks like if it goes through a slit that's 0.5 millimeter versus 1 millimeter versus 2 millimeters versus 3 millimeter wide versus a 4 millimeter gap. You ask that doctor what gap he intends to leave you, what he thinks is a nominal, normal air gap for a human being, and you'll likely get something like this. Oh no. So sad but true. It's their job to know, and they don't know. And if you ask them specific questions like that, you often get a very befuddled look on their face, and they're bummed that you're calling them out because they're used to doing whatever they want and not being questioned about it. So here's where I help on my website. I've read a lot of these studies, and I've done my own study, and I've lived with it. And I, in very general and also very specific terms, convey to people how the nose works, what the limits are, and I actually put numbers on things. And so my very first post here is called, the topic section is on the right-hand side, is called What is an Aggressive Nasal Surgery? Like, how much is too much? So I mentioned that there's an optimal gap that allows air to pass while allowing some microturbulence to occur, which allows the air to properly contact the wet mucosa tissue. So the air comes in from the outside world into your nares in laminar flow, nice and orderly. It gets narrowed down, and then it turns turbulent at the nasal valve and the heads of the inferior turbinates. It's then distributed all through the rest of your cavity against your turbinates and against the walls, where a transition of energy and thermal convection and moisture occurs. So when they make it too large, the bulk of the fluid, like a river, gently flows through without any contact of the outer walls, right? And so there's a term called a Reynolds number, and that's a scientific term for flow that's used to predict the threshold level where a fluid flow turns from laminar to turbulent. And for a normal person, I point out, where if you sit there and breathe and listen to the sound coming out of your nose, you can breathe very slowly and you can hear kind of a smooth flow, and as you pick up your intensity and how hard you want to breathe out through your nose, all of a sudden you hear it change to turbulent. There's a transition point where you can hear it click on. Well, people like myself and Scott and many other unfortunate people that were suffered from too much surgery, you can't breathe in deep enough or fast enough or out fast enough or hard enough to even get this effect. It's just an orderly flow. There's no contact with the walls. The air just glides right through the center of this over open hole. It's bad news. So in this post, I also point out that there's supposed to be what's called a standard of care when you see doctors that assures that you receive some kind of standard of decent care, right? But ironically, the issue here is that I've already proven and will continue to prove that there's no standards for nasal surgery in the first place. You know, this is really sad because in engineering and the production of any products, of course, it's a recipe for disaster. When you let people do whatever they want, to whatever degree they want, as often as they want, whatever manner they want to follow procedures or not, or whatever, it's disaster. But with the medical field, hey, that's okay, right? So not only is there a standard of care, which doesn't really mean anything, but there are CPT codes, which are billing codes that your insurance uses to pay doctors. And these are very specific. They're way more specific than these doctors usually are about what they're doing to people. So for instance, if the doctor was going to claim that he did a submucosal resection, it said that he had to prove that he operated on the mucosa with its preservation while removing or reducing a portion of the underlying bone, meaning they're not allowed to just blanket cut off sections of your tissue. They're supposed to gently go in a specific manner and reduce a little bit of bone from underneath. That's it. So they're very clear here. In the second part, they mention that if any portion of the inferior turbinate is removed, they have to refer to this as this code, excision inferior turbinate, partial or complete. They can't go calling a subtotal turbinectomy a SMR. So here's the crux of this entire post, and at least in general terms, I describe what and why and how. So at this point, we know that ENS is surgically caused, and it's the result of removing too much tissue. Yet the ENT industry has been rather adept at avoiding and deflecting any and all blame. So a fair question would be, how much is too much? And then, what is an aggressive nasal surgery? So using real-world common sense, logic, and science, we just learned that RE is a dimensionless number that takes into account multiple variables to tell us where the transition point is for any system. So basically for you, for a human nose, it's the point where the gaps become large enough, straight enough, and long enough to render your nose ineffective for its intended design purpose by its brilliant designer, creator, and engineer, God. Alright, so in my second post, down here on the right, called Modeled Submucosal Resection SMR Surgery. So this is ideally what you would want if you have some kind of an issue. You want basically a natural kind of a result, not something where a bunch of your anatomy is hacked off. And so the basic concept is these blue slices are CT scan model slices, and each slice is a left-right image. Left is before, right is my modeled version of an SMR. So instead of some hackneyed aggressive surgery, I very gently reduce the diameter. So for instance, if you look at the first picture, there's like no change. But as you start slicing into the model, by the third picture, you can see this gap where my mouse is on the left. You can see it getting bigger on the right side. And you follow that right on through. And on the last picture on the top row, you see the inferior turbinate's pretty large, and the white gap around it of air gap is actually pretty tight, right? So then you look to the right, and it's the same turbinate. All I did was basically pretend that you opened it up internally and took some out, and I retained the basic shape without cutting three-dimensional areas of it off. And I carried this all the way through. So these are model slices at varying points along the way through the model. So these are the CFD results of what air looks like when it's passed through the model. So you can see the very first slice, it's red, which is velocity. So it's a high velocity, and it's red at the bottom, the middle, and the top, as it was, right? So there's a narrow gap, and you're trying to fit all this air through, and it can't go through low, so it's going through the middle, it's going through the top. It's evenly trying to get through, but it's a little reduced, right? So the right-hand side of that first image is still the very front tip of the nose, but the whole model has been changed behind it. And so you can already see that the very front of the new model, after you've had a proper surgery, you can see less intensity at the top and a little more intensity at the bottom. As you carry that through, say by the time you get to this third slice, the air that was traveling really fast along the top of the inferior turbinate is now alongside and underneath of it in the cavity. So by the time you get to the fifth slice, the air that was compressed all the way through the top of the nose and a lot through the middle has been evened out, and you can see that air is now allowed to and is flowing around the bottom of the turbinate, and it's actually kind of even from the middle, the bottom, and the top of the nose. So as we progress through the slices, you can see that air was having trouble getting through before, and now it's pretty open, and it's open in a nice even uniform gap, and the air is pretty evenly distributed around in the top of the nose, the middle of the nose, and the bottom of the nose. That's what you want. And if you look at the very first image, there's a B, and a C. A C on the right-hand side, this is basically your septum right here, this little bump. And so what I had happen to me and what I've seen in the modeling, if you go and flatten your septum here, you're allowing all that air to just not only get right under that turbinate, but then stay under there. I'll show you what that looks like a little later. If you go and flatten the septum, you pretty much guarantee that you're no longer going to have a nice even distribution through your nose. So now we'll look at this model and we'll talk about nasal resistance and why you may want some as a human being on this earth breathing air. So if you know the nasal pressure, you can calculate the resistance. Now we create negative pressure when we suck our lungs open and draw air in. It creates a negative pressure inside the lungs in your airway. Now this induces a wider opening of what's called the distal bronchioles, and this is necessary for proper alveolar gas exchange in your lungs. So nasal resistance during expiration also helps maintain lung volume. So this is the negative pressure that I had, and the blue line was before I was ever operated on. The green line is my modeled SMR for, hey, this is about what a normal person should look like. And the blue and the black line is where these doctors unfortunately put me, which was next to no nasal resistance whatsoever. Now to put numbers on this, I went through and read up a little bit, and it says that what is normal resistance? So it's been reported in literature that the mean total resistance in normal subjects ranges between 0.15 and 0.39 PA per centimeter cubed, with a mean of 0.23 PA per centimeter cubed. So this is about normal. Now if you look at my calculated resistance based on the pressure and the flow, and again you look at the blue line, this is before I was operated on at all, and you can see, okay, my nasal resistance was past that 0.3 spec. I was down here at 0.48 roughly, okay? Now if you look at the green line, this is where a normal person and my model for what a normal anatomy situation would yield. There you are, you're pretty close to that mean, aren't you? There's your 0.2, there's your 0.3, you're kind of right in that middle range. So again, sadly, this is where my two doctors left me with almost zero nasal resistance. So my conclusion, it says this appears to be a perfect surgery and that it alleviated physical obstruction for the right side, and it did it in a manner that evenly distributed the air in all areas of the nose to share the load of filtering, heating, and humidifying the inspired air, and it left mucosa tissue and nerves in place to interact with the airstream. This is what you want. This is why the SMR technique has the best known results, and it's the preferred surgery as stated by Moore, Kern, Pasquale, and others. Subtotal and total turbinectomies, as well as other aggressive turbinate management operations, should really not be performed, and people should be warned. Here's some quick opinions regarding these surgeries, and I'll let you hit the space bar and pause if you want to read over these. Numerous procedures have been proposed. Complete or even partial amputation of the inferior turbinates should not be performed for benign inflammatory diseases. Submucosal inferior turbinate reduction, which does not disrupt the mucosal surface of the inferior turbinate and still preserves its three-dimensional shape, is the preferred procedure. Again, here's another opinion from Pasali. Same thing, basically. You can read these over. Moore, Kern. E. Hoising, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Wang, Dion, Hao, Pu, Lee, Gordon. There's lots of opinions out there that the submucosal resection is about as good as they have. Alright, so now that we know what we would like to get, how do we know that we can actually get it? How do you know that the doctor is actually going to be truthful in telling you the correct name procedure that he's going to do, and how do you know that he's actually going to do it correctly, and how do you know that he's not going to do extra procedures that you didn't even agree to beyond what he said he would do? This gets pretty tricky, and for instance, I'm going to show you two movies I found online that both claim to be turbinoplasties, which is some particular variant, and these two surgeries are nothing alike, yet both doctors are calling them turbinoplasties. I'm going to kind of skip through some of this. So in this first surgery, you can see they're coming in through the head of the inferior turbinate, through the front, which, if you're going to have something done and you're miserable, I think I'd prefer this method over having someone hack stuff off. So they go in and internally suck out some of the insides with a little Dremel tool and a vacuum. So they're leaving the outer edge of the mucosa intact. They're not cutting any of it off. They're not breaking the surface. They're making one limited hole in the front. And that's their finished result. So the turbinate still occupies a good amount of space. The air has to go around it, and your tissue is still intact with your nerve endings, which run on the outside of the tissue. This video claims to be a turbinoplasty. Same tool, different guy using the tool. Now to me, it sure looks like he's hacking right across the bottom of this thing, cutting three-dimensional areas completely off, just ripping this thing open. I covered up this guy's name here, but he was apparently proud of his work. To me, it looks like he just ripped a chunk of tissue out of this person. Okay, that doesn't look anything like the turbinoplasty that the other doctor did, yet both doctors are calling this a turbinoplasty. And you can see there's just a huge void of volume in this nose now. It's a 10 millimeter hole there. The informed consent is a very important topic because it's the only way you can really protect yourself. So what is informed consent? I found this online. It's when they give you information about a particular treatment or test so that you can decide whether or not you wish to undergo that treatment or test. They're supposed to explain to you the risks as well as the benefits. So the legal term for failing to obtain informed consent before performing a test or procedure on the patient And doing that procedure is called battery, and it's a form of assault. So here's a few quick examples of what I'm talking about. Like myself, I found out 6 years after the fact, going downhill in pain, that I had a turbinectomy that I never agreed to. Oh my God, I'm so angry. I'm finding out years later what this doctor did to me. This bastard removed my turbinates without informing me. So she's posting her records online here to our group, and the records say there's evidence of remote history of sinus surgery as evident by the removal of the medial walls of the maxillary sinuses bilaterally and inferior turbinates. So this doctor removed both inferior turbinates and punched holes through the walls of her lateral walls into the sinuses without telling her. So here's another example. This person said they had a deviated septum and some inflammation from a sinus cavity which caused excess mucus. When I saw this doctor, he told me he'll straighten the septum and remove a little bit of tissue. Actually, he cut my turbinates, out-fractured them, shaved the septum so much to the point that I'm left with no structure, damaged my nerves, and caused scarring to the point where my nose burns, stings, feels cold and painful 24/7. He never even mentioned the word turbinates, and never knew that they were cut until last year when I asked for the surgery report. I also found out that in order to get to this maxillary sinus cavity, he out-fractured the middle turbinate as well. I'm so severely damaged. And if any of you at home are kind of questioning this, saying, hey, you know, when I buy things from Amazon, I look at the reviews and there's always some people somewhere that are unhappy and complaining about something, this goes on and on and on and on and on. If you join one of these groups, this is not a few people. This is a lot more people than this should be happening to for something that's a supposedly known entity. This girl says, I'm most upset because my surgery wasn't necessary. It feels like a rape. Now, this is not an overstatement. This is what it feels like. You just heard the legal term for them doing procedures that you did not agree to. It's battery and assault. Battery, assault, rape. Now, these sound like some pretty strong, heavy-duty words to be tossing around, but I got to tell you, when it's you and you wake up and you're in pain, or you find out years later and there's nothing you can do at this point because it's irreversible, and you find that anatomy was taken out of you that you never agreed to. You said, I agreed to procedure X, like a septoplasty, trimming some tissue, and you wake up not only with procedure X, but procedure Y and Z done too, and you never agreed to it. Guess what? They substituted their judgment for your judgment and your informed consent. They robbed you of your anatomy, and you'll never have it back. And they should be held legally responsible for those bad decisions. So this person 20 years ago went to the doctor about a sore throat. Looks like they was told it was caused by a deviated septum. He says there was no allergy testing, no informed consent. I was not expecting the immense pain when I woke up 4 years ago. After several visits to ENTs, I was informed I had most of my left turbinates removed. This person, I agreed to a septoplasty and trimming of some scar tissue from a previous surgery. The result, she had 50% of her inferior turbinates resected on both sides, cut with surgical scissors, and the left middle turbinate amputated completely. Again, if you don't want to be over-resected, you have to educate yourself, and you cannot trust ear, nose, and throat doctors. They don't deserve your trust. Doctors say that empty nose syndrome is controversial, and that they don't know why one person gets it and another one does. And it is true that having a CT scan that looks quite empty is not a predictor that you will have empty nose syndrome and you will have all of those nasty symptoms. However, there are some people that have CT scans that look not even as bad, and they will get it. And doctors don't know why. Alright, I'll try to answer why some people get empty nose syndrome and some don't, and it's going to be a bit of a long answer, but let's start right now. So these are a list of undeniable mechanical aspects that change with these aggressive surgeries. and able to change by orders of magnitude beyond normal. And what that means is if you have a normal CT scan and you're a normal person and you look at these parameters and the numbers that you would get for these, and then you look at these wide open CT scans, your numerical results will be orders of magnitude beyond what everyone else on the planet walking around with a normal nose has. So if you have CT scans that look like ones I've shown, these things will change, and whether you call it empty nose or whether you're bothered by it, I don't know, but you will have velocity of air will have changed quite a bit, the amount of air, the distribution profile of air, where it was more in your upper nose and now it's going along the floor of the nose, the temperature of the air, the humidity amount by the time it hits your throat, the resistance, the pressure, the amount of shear stress, and the Reynolds number for laminar flow and where it turns turbulent. So all these things will drastically change. Now whether or not it means you have empty nose or you're bothered by these things, I don't know, but these are undeniable mechanical changes. So this next list is a lot more in depth, and I'm just going to leave it up on the screen for you if you want to hit pause and you can read it. The ones that are in orange are ones that I'm not saying you will get, but if it turns into empty nose syndrome, the orange ones come into play. The red ones are just unavoidable mechanical changes that are pretty undeniable. Orange is what can happen if things keep going wrong for you. In continuing trying to answer the question why some get it and some don't, and maybe one person's CT scan doesn't even look as bad as someone else's, yet they have it, and someone with a worse looking CT scan seems okay. So first of all, there's varying degrees of these symptoms, and many are nothing like you've experienced in the rest of your life. So you, the patient, really don't even know what it is. The symptoms are central nervous system type issues, and they can seem unrelated to your nose. Like your sleep gets worse, you have anxiety, you're out of breath more easily, you're fatigued, your arms and legs may feel weak. You just have no idea because it's your nose, and it just doesn't seem like that. And in terms of your nose, dryness can feel just like plain old obstruction, which is something you're familiar with. You may or may not have feelings of suffocation, and that's something that you wouldn't recognize because the rest of your life you've never had it. So to most who don't know the paradoxic obstruction, it just feels like you can't breathe through your nose, even if you can. That's why they call it paradoxic obstruction. Usually by the time you finally realize that it's your nose, and it's obvious because your suffocation has gotten so much worse that it feels like you're suffocating, and the dryness has gotten incredibly extreme to the point where you have nerve pains, it's too late by that point. So the next thing to keep in mind is that there are no diagnostics. There's no measurements for this. Not only that, but these doctors that justified these studies that made turbinate reductions look good in the first place, they didn't measure anything when they did these studies. The nose has 3 basic functions, and they didn't measure any of them before and after these turbinate reduction surgeries, so they don't know then, and they're not going to know now with you sitting right across from them. And then assuming you saw the same doctor who performed your surgery for the follow-up and you're unhappy, do you think they're going to tell you, hey, there's this thing called empty nose syndrome? No, of course not. And even when doctors do see it and they know what it is, many won't say anything because there's nothing they can do. ENS patients just get bounced from one doctor to the next, and you have to pay a lot of money every time you see a doctor and every time they stick a scope up your nose, and many just don't have the money. Now I'm going to get to the meat and potatoes that I've been promising you of how this affects you. If you've heard of empty nose syndrome or had a doctor mention it or seen it on my site or just basically looked at the term, basically what they say is that empty nose syndrome is rare. That's the first thing you'll hear from doctors. And that's their official story. They kind of consider it digital, like it can only exist in one of 2 states. It's a 1 or it's a 0. It's on or it's off. So they look at it like this. They claim that there's some large number of surgeries, like on this bottom axis, say 1,000. And then it's a bar graph. So this one bar, the 1,000th person has a problem. And if you look at the left axis, it's either a 1 or a 0. So all these other people from 0 to 999 have no problems whatsoever. They're at zeros. And all of a sudden this poor 1,000th person is at a 1. They have empty nose syndrome. Okay, so that's what they're trying to tell you. So they live in a bit of a fairyland tale situation. They don't recognize that it's not black or white, it's not on or off, that there's many levels of failure. And their original studies, when they looked at their justifications for doing turbinectomies and SMRs and turbinoplasty and septoplasty and radiofrequency and all these various reductions and whatever, they didn't measure much in these studies. All they concerned themselves with was obstruction, passing air through a larger opening, which they made larger, and they most often consider it a success. They didn't do long-term studies, long-term follow-ups. They didn't measure sleep. They didn't even measure any of the 3 basic functions of the nose: heating, humidifying, or filtering. And they didn't do adequate follow-up. You're supposed to follow up 5 to 7 years afterward, and a lot of these studies stopped at less than 3. So unfortunately for them, and more unfortunately for you if you're on the wrong side of this, this is how things work in the real world. There is no just black and white on very many issues in physics or in life anywhere. Generally, if you affect one variable, it affects the outcome of the entire equation. And in nonlinear ways, one variable can affect multiple other things. And for example, this is how negative pressure varies as a function of slit diameter in your nose. So on the x-axis, if you have a smaller diameter opening, you have a greater negative pressure, and as the doctors open up that nose bit by bit, you lose negative pressure, heading on up there toward darn near 0, which is no negative pressure. I mean, you could theoretically have a tracheostomy, like a hole in your throat, and you're not going to have any nasal resistance. You're not even breathing through your nose. And a lot of people get surgeries that make their nose so open, they're almost, like myself, I was almost approaching 0 resistance. Now, this graph looks pretty dry and not real exciting, and many will say, okay, well, how does this affect me? This is wonderful. Well, here's how it affects you. So from Dr. Mark's study, it says a higher negative pressure induces wider opening of the distal bronchioles in the lungs, which is necessary for proper alveolar gas exchange. And nasal resistance during expiration also helps maintain lung volume. So you need a certain amount of resistance in your nose for your lungs and diaphragm to function properly and to get proper gas exchange. I hiked my whole life, and I used to be able to dance up mountains. And after my first surgery, I was hiking with my wife, and we were up a hike that I'd been up many times before, and it wasn't even a hard hike. And I found myself getting lightheaded and dizzy as I crossed the stream, I remember. And it was almost like I walked into a glass wall face first. And all of a sudden, I reached this thing where I honestly thought I was having a heart attack. And I had to sit down. I thought maybe it was a heart attack. And I was just sitting on the ground for a while. And that was my first indication that, my life had changed after nasal surgery. So these are the kind of things that it affects for some people. So maybe if you're a couch potato, you may not notice this. If you work behind a desk, you may not notice this. If you're an NBA player, a soccer player, or someone who hikes, guess what? A turbinectomy may really mess you up. So here's another example. This is called a nonlinear relationship where things react in a nonlinear fashion. So this is shear stress, the amount of tugging forces against the walls of your mucosa tissue versus, again, diameter of the slit of the opening of your nose. So if you have a small diameter opening, you have a good amount of shear stress. As your nose gets more open and open and open, you get less shear stress to almost no shear stress. So again, you may say, hey, this looks like some really boring crap. What are you telling me this for? How does this affect me? Well, from Dr. Mark here, Surgery of the Turbinates and Empty Nose Syndrome, great study. It is accepted that optimum pressure values within narrow limits, so there's a narrow limit for normal persons to work here, right? It triggers both mucus production in the goblet cells as well as ciliary function to regulate mucociliary clearance at the cellular level. Now, cilia are little hair-like follicle structures that are on your nasal mucosa tissue that live in this wet blanket of muck that your nose produces. And when you breathe in debris, it's your nose's job, the filtration part, to trap this stuff. And these little cilia sweep, and they all sweep toward the back of your throat. So all the trash that your nose is filtering out for your lungs to keep your lungs clean is safely being swept down your throat and you're swallowing it. So what he's saying is without pressure and shearing force, you're not going to have this. And he mentions how ENS people are screwed up and why. I'll let you read that if you want to pause. So next relationship, here's velocity of air. You can see again a narrow slit, high velocity of air. Open up the slit diameter, guess what? The velocity drops, and also the distribution from your upper nose to your middle nose. It all drops into your lower nose, and often at a lower velocity than originally went in there. Now here's an example of a linear relationship, and this is also very important for you. This is a good graph that someone did a study similar to mine, but they were able to measure humidity as well. I only measured warming capacity, but they said that the relationship is synchronous, meaning that one follows the other. If you have warming, you have humidity, and it looks like roughly the same exact relationship. They're both linear, okay? So bottom left to upper right, you start in the nose at 0.1, which is kind of just getting in, and you immediately start warming and humidifying. At 0.2 through the nose, maybe a third of the way through, more humidification, more heating. At 0.3, you're probably past midpoint, and it's still going up in linear fashion. And at number 4, when they look at the output of the nose, they both went up in linear fashion at the same slope, heating and humidification. This is key for your lungs, oxygen transfer, and your quality of life as a human being on this planet. So this shows the actual warming of inspired air. This is a model I did of my actual surgical history. So the top is before I had any nasal surgeries at all. And the color-coded scale here on the left, blue is the input to the model air. It's 20 degree C, room temperature air. And then the head and tissue I put at 37 degrees C, your nasal tissue, your head, which is human body temperature. And I let the cool air come in, and I see how far it gets before it's conditioned in your nose. So as you can see, my normal left side pre-surgery nose, it comes in blue, and guess what? By a third of the way in, it's already processed down to green, and by the time it's to the back of your throat, it's deep orange, which is, you know, darn near most of the way toward the temperature of your tissue, isn't it, right? And that's in a fraction of a second. So after my first surgery, this middle picture here, you can see the blue room temperature air streaming darn near 3/4 of the way through my nose with nothing happening at all. It's still 20 degree temperature air, right? No processing. And then even worse, it's a shame for me they didn't explain and let me know what was going on, or they don't know what's going on, but they made my situation way worse. So you can see with the second surgery, where they opened me up even more, now the room temperature air in blue comes in the left side and goes straight through to the back of the throat. Non-processed air all the way at the back of the throat. Non-heated, non-humidified, non-filtered. This is how this can affect you. So you can also do what's called a characterization. A characterization is just like a quick proof of concept, like does air convection really happen better for a narrow gap versus a larger gap? So I just made a simple 5 centimeter long slit in a model, and then I just made the slit larger, and I said, okay, what does the air look like? And you can plainly see that, I mean, a 6-year-old child can see that a narrow gap quickly heats the air. And as you make the gap bigger, it has less and less effect, less convection occurs, and as you make the gap pretty darn large, guess what? There's almost no processing of air, just like I showed you. This is how life works, okay? So these surgeries drastically alter all these mechanical aspects that I was able to lay hands on and directly measure, which most of their studies do not. And the problem that I have with these doctors is that they're changing people orders of magnitude beyond normal. I mean, we looked at normal CT scans and they're producing abnormal CT scans, and again, like they're mystified by instances of failure. So I modeled a properly performed submucosal resection, and that result this green line shows up as normal. Look at that, it's right in the middle of their range. I went up before I had a surgery. The one side was indeed obstructed a bit. It was down here at a little bit beyond their 0.39 range. However, the surgeries that they produced here are this black and red line, and you can see they obliterated almost all nasal resistance. In one surgery, they took me from a little obstructed to almost zero nasal resistance.